Welcome to episode 1 of my podcast. I'm Manjit Kaur Ruprai and I'm a narcissistic abuse recovery therapist. This is a story about a woman who contacted me to share her story. Her name has been changed to protect her identity, and whoever else I may mention, I'm going to call her Simi. Trigger warning. This will mention domestic violence. If this is triggering for you, you might want to skip this episode. I'm going to tell her story about being beaten and stalked by her husband. If you are going through this, please get help in your local area, work with the police, and lean on friends and family for support. Someone will help you to be safe. Once domestic violence starts, it does not stop, and in some cases, it even leads to death. Simi was a confident, strong-minded, independent woman before she met her boyfriend in her 20s. They dated for 5 years before they decided to get married. She felt this was the next step to help the relationship grow. She thought she knew him well enough and was ready to get married. But she knew deep down the relationship was not perfect. There were things niggling at her. But she carried on hoping things would get better. Like any other relationship, they had the odd disagreement, but that was quite normal, and she thought nothing of it. For the most part, he was kind and considerate, and he made her happy. She was from an Indian background, and the pressure was on for her to get married. Her parents often made passive-aggressive remarks at her, that she is getting too old and needs to find a husband soon. They also told her that others are getting married and that she needs to do the same. She felt she wasn't getting any younger and felt immense pressure in her community to be married. She thought 5 years was long enough to get to know her boyfriend. Being married would keep her parents happy, as she would never have to listen to being put down for not being married again by her parents and the rest of her family. One weekend, Simi plucked up the courage and told her parents she has a boyfriend. They were delighted, but also cautious, as they had not chosen him for her, and they knew nothing about him. Simi and her boyfriend arranged for both families to meet. She was happy things were finally moving along, and her parents finally knew about him. After they had left, Simi's parents said they got a bad vibe from her boyfriend and they didn't like him, but they couldn't put their finger on it. They began to ask around about him to friends and family, and they did not like what they heard. He had a shady past and had been into trouble with the law for tax fraud. But Simi didn't believe any of it. She went into cognitive dissonance, also known as denial. This is when you have two conflicting thoughts going through your head simultaneously. On one hand, she knew her parents wouldn't lie to her, but on the other hand, she refused to believe it. She convinced her parents that she wanted to marry him. After back and forth of arguing with her parents, they agreed. Months later, they were married. Soon after the wedding, she knew that it was a mistake and it turned out to be the worst nightmare of her life. And her scars are still healing many years on. Simi moved in with her in-laws. This was not meant to have been a long-term arrangement. It was an opportunity for her to get to know her in-laws and for them to save money for a house. 18 months on, things were still the same, and her husband made no mention of moving. Her husband was a successful property developer, and within 2 years of starting his business, he had 25 properties and was making lots of money. She knew they could afford a house, but she knew there was something else holding him back. 2 years had gone by, and nothing has changed. She fell pregnant, but she noticed a change in her husband's behaviour. She hardly saw him, and he was becoming withdrawn. There was something different about him. She had dated him for 5 years, but they had never lived together until now. She questioned whether she actually knew him. He stopped spending time with her. He was out most of the time, and she didn't get to see him. Simi's suspicions grew, and all kinds of thoughts were racing through her head. One afternoon, she decided to go to his office, but she wasn't prepared for what she was about to find. She looked through his drawers and files to see what she could find, and by chance she came across some pictures hidden in the bottom drawer. Her husband was kissing another woman. Tears welled down her face as she stood there shocked, confused and angry. 7 years she devoted to this man, and he had given her the ultimate betrayal. She left the office and decided to confront him later that day. He played the perfect victim and told her how it was a mistake and that she had come on to him. He begged her for forgiveness and that he would never do this ever again. They both cried. She forgave him and decided to move on from this. She was having his baby, and she didn't want to be a single parent. She kept the affair to herself. Over the weeks, there was some improvement in her husband's behaviour. She carried on as normal. She hardly saw him, but she didn't question him either. Then his behaviour reverted back to being shady within a matter of weeks, and he showed no interest in her. She was getting bigger with the baby. She felt paranoid at the back of her mind, and thoughts crossed her mind that he was cheating on her. She turned a blind eye to it, as she just wanted a baby to arrive healthy. What she didn't know wouldn't hurt her anymore, she thought. She finally went into labour. Even though he showed little interest in her, he still took her to the delivery room and cut their baby girl's umbilical cord. They held their baby together, and for a moment she thought they could live happily ever after and be the perfect family. People make mistakes, and she was ready to forgive him fully. After the baby, things took a turn for the worse, and the problems were far from over. Simi found out that her husband was in increasing debt, and his properties were being repossessed as he was spending too much. All sorts of thoughts ran through her mind. She wasn't seeing any of the money, and he hardly bought her or their baby anything. She was doing most of the work and providing for their little girl. He must have been blowing it on a lavish lifestyle, and the other woman he was seeing on the side. With the debts mounting up, Simi decided to give up her job and look after the properties, as she was a mortgage advisor and had lots of experience. The first beating took Simi by surprise. He had never shown any violence to her in the 8 years they had been together. After a small disagreement, he started to punch her around the face and kicked her in the ribs. She was startled and tried not to scream. Their little girl was only 6 months old. Simi was still recovering from having their baby. The beating shook her to the core. He wouldn't stop punching her and shouting at her in a fit of rage. As she fought her husband off, she quickly managed to reach for the phone and call the police. Her husband was arrested and given a caution. Her family taunted her for calling the police. They wanted it to be kept a secret from everyone else and to brush it under the carpet. Her in-laws blamed her for provoking her husband and said that she should have remained quiet. Can you believe that? They wanted her to keep quiet. Shocking. Things got really bad after that, and his behaviour worsened. He was becoming increasingly withdrawn and showed no interest in their girl or her. He wasn't around most of the time. This was not the man she had fallen in love with and had dated for 5 years. He had hidden it well. Every thought went through her mind, and she questioned the little red flags she had overlooked, the small white lies, the passive-aggressive remarks, and the ghosting. She really didn't know him. Perhaps this was the real him, but she so wanted him to change. This is not what she expected married life to be. His property development business continued to collapse, even though Simi put in every effort to keep things afloat. Secretly, he was spending all the money. The second beating took place 3 months later, where they had got back from a wedding. Her husband had been drinking excessively. When they got home, she could hear him on the phone with the other woman. He told her how much he loves her and wants to be with her. She couldn't control herself and confronted him. She felt cheated and defrauded with the deceit. Their whole relationship was based on lies. He lost his temper as she confronted him. He started to beat her in front of everyone in a fit of rage. He was uncontrollable. He swung massive punches in her head repeatedly, kicked and punched her in the ribs, through the dining table and chairs at her. He just didn't care who was there and watching. He wasn't even bothered about their girl, who screamed with the commotion. When his sister-in-law tried to control him, he swung her across the floor, leaving her bruised and grazed. The police were called again, and Simi was barely conscious when they arrived. He could have really killed her this time, as she lay in hospital, recovering. Simi returned to her dreaded marital home, all bruised black and blue, and still recovering. As time went on, she found more pictures of her husband hooking up with other women. After years of putting up with his infidelity, Simi thought another baby would save the marriage, although he paid little attention to their baby girl anyway. Don't judge. Please don't judge. There are more relationships like this than you know of. In toxic relationships, there can be a belief that a baby will save the relationship, but this really just adds to more problems. People also go into denial and will do anything to salvage the relationship. Even though she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before this marriage would end, she wanted to try and make things work. She thought a baby could save the marriage. She wanted her little girl to have a sibling that she could confide in and play with, just like Simi had a brother and sister to share her pain. She convinced her husband to have another baby. It didn't take much persuasion. A lot of people do not understand why she wanted another baby with a man that mentally, emotionally, and physically abused her. Abuse of this kind leads to trauma bonding, cognitive dissonance, and the victim going into shock and behaving in ways they usually would not. They would do anything to feed the fantasy of the relationship working out and taking drastic measures to accomplish this goal. Simi just wanted a happy family. She also wanted him to love her like the first time they met. although she felt sick every time she brought herself to making love to a man that abused her and probably no longer loved her. Her brain went into denial that it was a doomed marriage. Simi slowly began to set boundaries and gave her husband a year to sort his issues out. Within that time, they had another baby girl. In her head, she thought if after a year he does not prove himself, she would move out with or without him. She gave him plenty of warnings that if there is no improvement, she will be gone. He didn't believe her and carried on with his usual selfish ways like how they do. Simi slowly started purchasing things for their new home until the day finally arrived. Luckily, there was one property of theirs that had not been repossessed, so she decided she would live there with her girls and her husband if he chose to. A year later, she asked her husband if he wanted to move, and he responded by ignoring her and finally saying he will not be moving out. Her husband thought she was calling his bluff, but she packed her bags and moved out. The cheek of it was, he asked her, "Do you want a hand?" She turned around and said no, and walked out of that door to never look back again. Simi started her new life on her own. She found work and started to think of the road ahead and how she would survive on her own. But under no circumstances would she go back to her husband. He had promised her they would move out within 12 months of being married, and 7 years later they were still living with the in-laws in the same house. There was nothing wrong with that, but the principle is he had made promises to her that he hadn't kept. Plus she couldn't disregard the abuse. He was a completely different man to who she met. Maybe he was always like this and he hid it well. It wasn't long until her husband started calling her and asking to get back together with her, the classic hoovering technique. As he pleaded with her that he had changed and that he wants another chance, she fell for the hoover and decided she would give him another chance and let him move in with her. He was okay to start with and showed interest in her and the girls. Simi was hopeful and thought she finally had a family. Things soon took a turn for the worse, and within a few weeks, his behaviour was possessive. He would question his eldest daughter of their mother's whereabouts. The oldest daughter was a flying monkey without knowing it. On top of that, he didn't go to work anymore and brought no money in as his property development business had failed. He began shouting once again and throwing things around, and this terrified both her and her girls as there was no in-laws to fend him off. Although the in-laws enabled his behaviour, she still had someone else in the house. She was scared for herself and her girls. It wasn't long before she kicked him out and decided that enough is enough. She had to protect her girls. If something happened to her, no one would care for them. There was no going back now, and he would get no more chances. He was beyond recognition. This was definitely not the man she fell in love with. Simi finally filed for divorce. After a 2-year battle, the divorce finally came through, and Simi thought that she could put this disastrous marriage behind her and move on with her lovely girls. One day Simi was getting her car cleaned, and the car cleaner said that he had found a tracking device on her car. She looked baffled as it wasn't hers, and neither had she put it there. She showed her eldest daughter, and she said, "Mummy, I've seen pictures of you on Daddy's laptop." As she questioned her daughter further, she mentioned there was a camera, but she hadn't actually seen it. Simi was alarmed and decided to barge into her in-law's house, asking to see her now ex-husband's laptop. Nothing prepared her for what she was about to see. She found several pictures of her getting out of the shower and getting changed. She felt violated of her privacy. Some were of her naked. How could this man stoop so low? He didn't want to be with her, and neither would he let her go. Simi went through her home and found a small camera in her bedroom and several others that were planted around her house. He would also question their girls whenever they visited him. He asked intrusive questions about what their mother had been up to and if she was seeing anyone. The girls were too young and did not think anything of it. They felt uncomfortable, but did not anything more of it. She removed the cameras and had her home checked thoroughly for any more devices. All Simi could do was try to be the best parent that she could and ensure her ex-husband caused as little disruption to her as she could. The contact with the children was minimal, but he tried every opportunity he could to make things difficult. Many years on from her nightmare marriage, Simi has met someone else. Her daughters are settled into their new home, and she is taking every day as it comes. She still doesn't understand what went wrong and why her ex-husband, who suddenly changed into a man that she didn't know and fell in love with. Perhaps he was always like this, but he did well to disguise it. This will never be known, as he will never accept that his behaviour was unacceptable. All Simi can do is to move on and try to put the past behind her and to heal her wounds. When Simi contacted me about her story, I was deeply touched that she was willing to speak to me in confidence. It brought several tears to my eyes that a woman can be treated with no respect, be abused and beaten like a punch bag. This is not acceptable whether you're a man or a woman going through abuse. I am proud of Simi's recovery, and I wish her all the success and happiness that she deserves. Please like and share. If you have a story to tell, email me via my website. Thank you for tuning in to this episode.